Good evening, and welcome to a very special evening. I'm Don Zillman, the Dean of the University of Maine School of Law. Let me introduce the distinguished group of Americans before you. Judge Frank Coffin, about whom much will be said, and in whose name and honor we gather tonight. Justice William Brennan, the distinguished member of the United States Supreme Court for at least the last half century, and others would argue well beyond that. Mrs. Brennan, herself a longtime member of Supreme Court staff. Professor Dagmar Hamilton of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, and for 15 years collaborator with Justice William O. Douglas on his writings. Mr. Olie Rauh, litigation partner in the prestigious Washington law firm of Manat Phelps, and Mrs. Joseph Rauh, our first and main speaker tonight. We honor tonight three distinguished Americans: William Brennan, Frank Coffin, Joseph Rauh. I take particular pride in the fact that all are trained and have served as members of the legal profession. As you know, lawyers in the legal profession have never been free from controversy or criticism throughout history or today. But these three men make clear that lawyers in the legal profession are also the source of much that is best in America, and it gives us all enormous pride to recognize them as distinguished Americans. William Brennan, Frank Coffin, Joseph Rauh. What stands out in the mention of their names is public service, and that is our purpose here tonight. We begin an annual series of lectures under the sponsorship of the University of Maine School of Law that will allow us to bring to the school, to the University of Southern Maine, and to the Portland community persons who in their work and writing have viewed the law as a public profession and have viewed a commitment to public service as a required part of legal training. Our series honors a man who exemplifies the law and public service, the Honorable Frank M. Coffin. It is always a danger to introduce a legend to his friends, and there are many of you I know in this audience tonight. You know the Coffin legend, many of you, better than I. The humble birth in the log cabin, the long barefoot treks through the snow to the one-room schoolhouse, throwing the silver dollar, probably the quarter for the frugal Mainer, across the mighty Androscoggin, and manfully confessing to chopping down the blueberry tree. I cannot do justice to a legal career that has touched the public and private sector, all three branches of government, and for the last 25 or more years, the position as one of the distinguished members of the federal appellate judiciary. That is the public record. It is well known. It is indelible. What may not be so well known to the general public, though certainly is to Judge Coffin's friends, is the remarkable affection in which he is held by so many for so long. It is said that no man is a hero to his own valet, and a whole sordid generation of kiss and tell books have allowed staffers and superfluities to tell why princes presidents, and pop stars are less than they seem to the public. Frank Coffin is the exception that proves the great need not exclude the good. Our earliest enthusiasts in creating the Coffin Lectureship were that remarkable fraternity and sorority of Judge Coffin law clerks. Many are here tonight. All have encouraged us in our efforts. 3 deserve special thanks: David Cohen, Barbara Rigelhaupt, and Kane Smith, for their planning, their assistance. It is also appropriate to thank, for their many hours of work in putting the first of the series together, Joanne Ermeling, Barbara Gauditz, Colleen Corey, Christy Clifford of the law school. I know for them, for us, for me, it has been a labor of love. Our warmest Maine welcome goes out to Justice and Mrs. Brennan. It has been a remarkable visit. Their session this noon at the law school will live with us all for many years. Our thanks and admiration to Mrs. Rauh and Michael Rauh for completing another piece of the remarkable legal career of Joe Rauh. All of your presences here tonight remind us how well we have chosen in honoring Frank Coffin and how deeply we are touched by his contributions to the law in the state of Maine. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the man after whom the law school's lectures in law and public service are named, the Honorable Frank Coffin. Judge.
Thank you. This almost sounds like a political convention. Dean Silman, Justice Mrs. Brennan, Mrs. Rauh, Michael Rauh, and friends. To respond to such an honor with both candor and grace is a challenge. In the first place, to refer to the Dean's beginning remarks, I would remind you that a prophet is not without honor except within his own country, and so a judge is not without pomp except when he's at home with a dean like that. What helps me in this predicament of helping dedicate this lecture series is that this is not an honor that begins and ends in memorializing a person. Unlike a portrait, a statue, a plaque, or an award, this is functional. An honor serving as a beginning, a catalyst for a periodic event invested with high hopes. Because of my own aspirations for this lecture series, I gratefully lend it my name, knowing very well that there are not a few in this room and in this state whose name could appropriately adorn this program. Let me say a few words about the theme of this lecture series, Law and Public Service. In large part, this concept sprang from the tension that has always existed in the legal profession between its sense of noblesse oblige, its feeling of social obligation stemming from its unique access to the justice system, and its instinct for material gain. I suppose it is a fact that the profession was never as elevated and pure as we like to imagine it. Today's malaise, however, cannot be dismissed as just another example of déjà vu. We see a widespread distrust of institutions and their leaders, a bitter recognition of the gap between what we profess and what we do, and increasing frustration on the part of growing numbers of people in their efforts to to share in the American dream. All this has led to a distancing of many from the idea of service as a citizen, a threat to the whole idea of community, and particularly a loss of faith in the practice and processes of the law. Lawyers themselves are conscious of a very sharp and hostile focus on their profession. Much of the criticism overlooks the selfless service of many, particularly in the smaller communities. Much of it is directed at the gigantic firms serving the huge corporations, where fees seem linked not to quality of service, but billable hours, driven in turn by escalating costs and increasingly hardball competition. In such precincts, but also closer to home, public service is often squeezed out by the pressures of a focus on the bottom line. To keep alive the old ideal of service is, then, one reason for our theme. Another is much less solemn. It is that the ingredient of joyful satisfaction, of pure, unadulterated fun, as both Justice Brennan and Olie Rauh so well exemplify, is realized in its perfect state when a lawyer finds his energies directed to the public good. There is a fellowship in such an enterprise that makes even an exhilarating victory for a client pall in comparison. This kind of lectureship fits this school like a glove. Though small, its faculty and often its students have long demonstrated a consciousness of the primacy of public service in a lawyer's life. I cannot begin to list the areas of law and government where dedicated professors have given critical help to governors, legislators, the state court, public commissions, and to the clarification and development of state law, and where both faculty and students have competently and sacrificially served individuals in need. This program, therefore, is not so much carrying coals to Newcastle as helping Newcastle to distribute yet more widely its glowing coals. The scope of this series tonight could not be better outlined than by the two men we honor. They are the alpha and omega of law and public service. In Justice Brennan, we have a man whose service has been rendered as a public official, a judge of his state's superior and supreme courts, and for over a third of a century, an associate justice of the United States Supreme Court. In Joseph Rauh, we have a private citizen, a solo practitioner, whose impact on the development of our law, respecting the constitutional rights of individuals, is unsurpassed. First, Justice Brennan. Son of an immigrant coal heaver, he never forgot the harsh realities of life facing so many of our people. Blessed with abundant energy, a keen intellect, and a warm love for his fellow humans, including most especially his colleagues, he wrote or influenced the writing of more currently significant Supreme Court opinions than any other justice who has ever served the court. One man, one vote, libel claims and public officials, civil rights liability for federal officials, gender discrimination, school desegregation, procedural due process, free speech, and between 1961 and 1969, no fewer than 9 specific rights in the Bill of Rights incorporated in the 14th Amendment and made applicable to the states, and so much more. Just 2 stories about the justice. As a student at Harvard Law School, one of his mentors was Professor Felix Frankfurter, who took great pride in drumming into his charges the importance of thinking for themselves. Some years later, when young Justice Brennan had cast his first vote for a decision, older Justice Frankfurter stormed into the former's chambers saying, "You can't do that," to which the neophyte answered, "But I did." Look magazine later reported Justice Frankfurter as saying, "I wanted my students to think for themselves, but Brennan goes too far." Finally, when, after an exhaustive confirmation hearing in which he was badgered by Joe McCarthy, he was confirmed by a vote in which McCarthy shouted the only no. After that, Justice Brennan said he felt like a mule entered in the Kentucky Derby. "I don't expect to distinguish myself, but I do expect to benefit from the association." Well, we know who distinguished himself, and more important, who benefited from the association. As Professor Norman Dawson put it, but for Justice Brennan, we would today be living under a very different Constitution. Mr. Justice, we are deeply honored by your presence this evening and would love to have a word or two from you.
Good, you won't have to. Sit down and speak. Well. It really doesn't matter, and I'll tell you why. I am, and have been now for over a year, under the command of a series of doctors. They insisted some year and a half ago that I had a serious difficulty. I've never experienced it to my knowledge, but they tell me so, and any time I try to get out and make a speech, they come in like, well, in any event, and they give me all kinds of difficulty, assuring me that indeed I'd better take care of myself, by which they meant don't make any speeches, because whatever it is, something may happen which you'll regret and you'll all regret. So don't. So I haven't. So thank you, Judge Coffin. It's a privilege for me, as you know, to be here today at the first Coffin Lecture on Law and Public Policy. Frank Coffin has himself given long and selfless service to the country. He's been one of its finest and most distinguished judges for over 27 years. It's an honor for me, I can assure you, to be here today as you honor him. I particularly want to thank you for today's earlier session with the students and faculty of the law school. If you're looking for a speech, go back to some of those things that I said during our morning session. I know I broke the rule, but the doctors weren't here, so I didn't care. I immensely enjoyed answering the questions and discussing some of my experiences on the Supreme Court. And it's a special privilege to be here with Olie Rauh and her son Michael Before his untimely death, Joe Rauh was one of our nation's most effective and passionate advocates for civil rights and equal justice under the law. I look forward to hearing Joe's thoughts on the confirmation process for Supreme Court justices. And I think that's all you need from me in the way of a speech. If you can remember what happened this morning, just remember back to that and let that go for anything I might say tonight.
Court of Appeals and a Supreme Court justice. Court of Appeals judge spills the glass, makes a mess of things. The Supreme Court justice copes with a liquid script. Joe Rauh, in a time when we seem to have more celebrities than heroes, the name of Joe Rauh may be unfamiliar to some, but a little over 2 weeks ago, as Ruth and I sat in a packed University of D.C. auditorium, along with over 900 others at his memorial service, it seemed that the whole world mourned. In fact, along with Martin Luther King, Clarence Mitchell,